If we look at recent political eras in Britain, they line up eerily closely with key generations. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party came to power in late 1979, shortly ahead of the Millennial generation, which begins with those born in 1980. 18 years later, in 1997, Tony Blair and New Labour swept to power, a year after the point at which we start counting people as members of Generation Z. In 2010, David Cameron took power at the head of a coalition government. And whilst the final decision hasn't been made, 2010 and 2012 are typically suggested as the endpoint for Gen Z. Each political era is likely to have set the background for how each generation grew up. But how far have these coincidences affected each generation's political choices? We often find that Gen Z are called the activist generation, and they are assumed to be more politically active and switched on than previous generations. Greta Thunberg is held up as the role model and encapsulation of this newfound determination. And a top-level reading of the data might suggest this is true. In 2021, when they were aged 25 and under, 21% of Gen Z in Britain said they were very interested in politics. If we look back to 2007, when millennials were slightly older at 27 and below, just 14% said they were very interested in politics. But to take this comparison at face value would be to ignore the impact of the politically turbulent 2010s in the UK. Data from the British Social Attitude Survey shows that prior to 2010, we had a very short cohort effect, with flat lines for the level of interest each cohort had in politics. But over the following decade, we witnessed 4 general elections and 3 divisive referendum campaigns. We always find that political interest peaks around elections, and with no shortage of electoral events, we have seen a period effect of rising political interest among all generations. So whilst it is true that Gen Z are more politically interested than millennials were at a similar age, this is in the context of rising political interest across the board. Millennials are more engaged than Gen X were at a similar age, and the baby boomer generation are more plugged in than the pre-war generation were at a similar point. And another look at the bigger picture also reminds us that Gen Z are still the least politically interested generation. The iron rule that interest rises with age remains in place. This is reinforced by other measures such as political parties, where Gen Z and millennials are the party poopers. Each generation is less likely than the one that came before to say that they think of themselves as a party supporter. In the case of older generations, the level of affiliation recorded by the British Social Attitude Survey has been steady over the entire period of 1983 to 2019. Among younger generations, party ID has risen. Among millennials, it has risen from 8% to 25% between 2009 and 2019, but it is still lower than older generations. Gen Z appear to be more of an exception here, as they are similarly likely to millennials to say that they support one party over others. But it remains the case that younger cohorts are less likely to identify with party labels. This wasn't the case a decade ago. Whilst there was an age differential, it was less important than other factors like social grade and education. It remains to be seen whether the voting intention gulf remains as generations age. But this difference has emerged so quickly, it's likely to be period effects driven by policies the different parties are pursuing, such as Brexit, rather than a genuine cohort effect. And this data tells us that Gen Z and millennials are in fact very similar when it comes to voting intention. And of course, another iron law of politics also holds. Younger people are less likely to vote. This is perhaps the greatest rejection of the idea of a more activist generation. Looking at the 2019 general election, estimated turnout for the 18 to 24 bracket, which was almost entirely comprised of Gen Z voters, was just 47%, well behind even younger millennials in the 25 to 34 grouping. If we look back to the 2005 election, the closest comparator we have for millennials, turnout in the 18 to 24 bracket was estimated at just 37%. But even though we live in a more political age now, still Gen Z are far less likely to vote. And what about some of the key political issues, such as tax and spend? It is a picture of mostly similarities between Gen Z and millennials. Gen Z are less supportive of raising taxes and government spending, closely aligned with the millennials, and following a general rule that younger groups tend to be less supportive of higher taxes than average. Despite this, they are in favour of redistribution as other generations. The extent of the consensus across generations on the extent to which government should redistribute incomes is a period effect that rises and falls over time, and there are few differences by generation. Where we do see a difference is on benefits. Gen Z appeared to be much more supportive of welfare benefits for the poor than the somewhat more hard-nosed millennial generation. For instance, in 2021, 43% of Gen Z agreed that government spending on welfare benefits for the poor should be increased, ahead of 36% of millennials and 34% of Gen X. And if we look back to millennials in the early 2000s, very few held this opinion, sometimes fewer than 1 in 5 agreed. Despite the fortuitous connection between generations and British political eras, there is no sign that growing up under New Labour has created a generation with distinct political characteristics. There are no Blair babies, much as there was relatively little sign of Thatcher's children. Gen Z are more politically interested than millennials and Gen X were at similar ages, but they are living in a more political time where engagement is higher across the board, and Gen Z remain the least politically interested overall. When it comes to party preference, Gen Z are very similar to millennials. They are both on the same side of the political chasm that separates people of different ages in Britain, and other age-related patterns such as less party identification and lower turnout also hold. When we look at some of the big political decisions around tax and spending, we can, however, begin to see a distinct Gen Z worldview. This suggests to us that there are indeed some Gen Z specific values that we can explore.